Thank you for the invitation to come to Kansas. I knew before I came that I had connections with some of you who had come to our conference about ports and rail yard concerns in California a year or two ago. I'd met Eric, Dean Palos from the Johnson County Planning Division. And so, but I didn't realize until I got here that I actually would end up feeling a connection with the land in your beautiful community. I grew up in a rural neighborhood in northwestern Connecticut, a rural community with 4,000 people, and my grandmother had a 400-acre dairy farm, and a lot of the rolling hills here remind me of that experience growing up. So I felt very much at home when I arrived and did a little tour today of where the rail yard will be. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the environmental assessment and in general about why we believe from our experience in California that rail yards and distribution centers and truck congested highways are a concern in terms of your health. And I really thank Jennifer for her very quick rundown of all the different kinds of health effects. It makes the rest of our jobs easier in talking to you. So I'm from the Southern California Environmental Health Sciences Center. It's part of the University of Southern California. Jennifer referred to a number of studies that have been done by scientists at the University of Southern California, and I work with those scientists, but my job is to try to translate the complicated science that they do to the public so that the public understands the results. And I'd have to say that Dr. Peel, I think, did a very fine job of doing that. And what we want is for the research findings to be understood by the public, but we want to also be able to hear from people about what their concerns are. So in fact, in Southern California, our scientists working on air pollution first heard about problems with the ports expanding and the rail yards expanding from people who live near the ports and from people like Angelo Logan, wherever he just went, who lives near rail yards. And so I think that kind of interchange between scientists and the public is really important in terms of even affecting informing the research agenda, which it has done for us. So this was that big conference. We had 550 people looking at the health effects of air pollution from ports and rail yards and freightways, freight corridors. In 2007, we had 4 people come from Kansas. So I'd like to just start off the beginning with a little bit about the LA to Kansas City connection. Burlington Northern says that there are 2.4 million intermodal units or containers that move from the ports of LA and Long Beach through Gardner. This estimate was for 2007, so that big orange line has us at one end of it, and then you and probably on to Chicago at the other end on BNSF's Transcon line from LA to Chicago. So these containers, with goods that are made in Asia come into our ports. They get onto a truck, and so here you see some of the issues we have in Los Angeles with kids playing in close proximity to trucks and locomotives, and in this case, ships at the port terminal. This is what our 710 freeway looks like. So when we talk about whether the I-35 or I-70 and other roads in Kansas are going to be congested by all of this freight traffic, we would have to say, talk to us and learn from our experience. It can get really bad on those roads. This road is currently slated to have a number of lanes added to it, truck-only lanes, to double or triple the capacity of the number of trucks on it. So these containers go up the freeway to the BNSF Commerce Intermodal Facility, or they might go out to a distribution center. And in the environmental assessment, they say, oh, right now you've got a lot of agricultural land, and it's kind of a hodgepodge of agricultural land. We're going to have it be a more unified landscape. Well, in Riverside, this is what that unified landscape has ended up looking like. This was formerly dairy land, agricultural land in Riverside, Miraloma. And of course, the distribution centers might look sort of innocent, but next to each of those distribution centers, you have hundreds of trucks that are going in and out. And then perhaps the container goes on to another BNSF intermodal rail yard and on to Kansas on the BNSF Transcon line. So what we're concerned about here is that every aspect of this goods movement system, starting with the ships that run on bunker fuel, which is sort of worse than diesel, every aspect of the goods movement involves diesel engines. And so this is a list of the types of equipment that there are at rail yards, and unless there have been special efforts made by the railroad company, and in some cases in California, because we have very bad air, we've been working really hard to get the emissions down. So some of these types of equipment have been changed so they're no longer diesel, or they have been retrofitted so that they have fewer emissions. But these are the concerns that we have at the rail yard. And these are some of the concerns that I have about the environmental assessment and the Army Corps of Engineers study to figure out whether or not the way they looked at all the emissions coming out of all of these different pieces of equipment was accurate. Again, engine exhaust contains lots of particles and gases, and to be fair to the industry, I put a picture of Union Pacific down on the bottom, so he wasn't just singling out BNSF here. So the Army Corps of Engineers did an environmental assessment of the Gardner proposed intermodal facility and the logistics park. And one of the questions we have is, did they accurately account for all of the different sources of diesel air pollution? But more importantly, we were concerned that the Army Corps of Engineers implies that there's no health impacts from diesel exhaust. Now, in California, we regulate diesel exhaust very stringently, and there aren't the same kind of rules in California, and there aren't the same kind of rules for US EPA. But yet, US EPA itself says that diesel exhaust has very serious health effects. So we're concerned that the Gardner IMF EA, the environmental assessment, did not review the health effects data, the type of data that Dr. Peel talked about with all those air pollution studies and research findings. You won't find pages and pages of those descriptions in the environmental assessment. There is not a health risk assessment that analyzes what kind of cancer risk would there be for people who live in close proximity to the rail yard. There's no detailed discussion about the health risk assessments that were done in California at other rail yards. And there's a sense that when you read the document, that the Corps is kind of minimizing the risk from exposure to diesel exhaust. So I went online and looked at some of the, last year the US EPA published a new rule on locomotives. So I read the rule to see what did they say about diesel exhaust last year. Well, they said diesel exhaust is of special public health concern. This is US EPA in 2008. It's classified as a cancer-causing chemical, and that the EPA analysis of the study shows that there's a positive relationship between diesel exhaust exposure and lung cancer. So US EPA says this is something that we really do need to be concerned about. Ultrafine particles that Dr. Peel talked about, the very tiny particles that you can breathe in, they get into your lungs, they can go in through your nose and get up to your brain. These very tiny particles are in diesel exhaust, US EPA says, and they can get deep into the lung, and yet the environmental assessment has no discussion about ultrafine particles or about their effects. US EPA talks about what it's like to live near a rail yard, and in their locomotive rule they conclude people living near major roadways and rail yards are likely to experience greater diesel exhaust exposure levels than the overall US population, putting them at greater health risk. And yet that statement is not in the environmental assessment. And I can't find any statements like that about research findings about living near busy roads and freeways and highways and rail yards. So goods movement overall, in LA it's ships. Here you don't have ships, but you have a lot of the rest of it in terms of rail yards and distribution centers and trucks. It creates regional pollution. That means that some of the pollution that happens here is going to affect people in Kansas City. But it also affects local pollution, meaning that if you are at Gardner High School and you're close to the rail yard, that the local pollution from the rail yard, within that distance from the rail yard, may be impacting the children at the high school. And we know from studies that there are lots of tiny particles, these ultrafine particles that are near highways. This is that truck congested freeway that I showed you with all the trucks on it, the 710. I don't have a pointer, I'm afraid, but that 0 is the middle of the freeway, and it's showing you that on the east side of the freeway where the wind blows, there's a very high number of those tiny, tiny particles coming right out of the exhaust of the trucks on the 710. And so tremendous concerns about people who live within that